When Blue came home without his rider, the old rancher's world shattered. But what the battle-scarred horse led him to discover would change everything he thought. He knew about his son's final days and reveal a secret that had been buried with. The dead dot the morning mist clung to the valley like a shroud as Jedediah McKenna stood on his porch, watching his son Caleb gentle a wild mustang in the corral. At 68, Jedediah's weathered hands bore the calluses of a lifetime spent working this harsh Montana land, but his eyes still held the sharp gleam of a man who understood horses, and the even rarer gift of understanding the bond between. A cowboy and his mount. "Easy now, Blue," Caleb's voice carried across the morning air, soft as velvet, but firm as iron. The magnificent stallion, coat the color of storm clouds, with a white blaze down his face, responded to the young man's touch as if they shared the same heartbeat. Blue had been wild when Caleb found him 3 years ago, but now the horse moved with his rider as one creature, sensing Caleb's thoughts before they became commands. Jedediah smiled despite the worry that had been gnawing at his gut for weeks. War was coming, everyone could feel it in the air, like the electricity before a thunderstorm. The newspapers spoke of tensions escalating between the states, and young men throughout the territory were already talking of duty and honor. Caleb, at 24, had that same restless look in his green eyes that Jedediah recognized from his own youth, the look of a man who felt the pull of something larger than himself. "Pa, you watching me show off again?" Caleb called out, swinging down from Blue's back with the fluid grace that had made him the finest horseman in 3 counties. Blue immediately nuzzled his shoulder, seeking the sugar cube that always waited in Caleb's shirt pocket. "Just making sure you don't get too big for your britches," Jedediah replied, but his pride was evident in every word. This boy, this young man, was everything he'd hoped for in a son. Strong, honorable, with a heart as big as the Montana sky, and away with horses that bordered on mystical dot as Caleb approached the porch. Blue trailing behind like a faithful dog, Jedediah noticed the letter clutched in his son's hand. The paper looked official, bearing the seal of the United States Army. His heart sank even as he'd been expecting this moment. "It came this morning," Caleb said quietly, his eyes meeting his father's. "They're forming a cavalry unit in Fort Benton. Colonel Morrison specifically requested men who know horses." He paused, running his free hand through his sandy brown hair, a gesture so reminiscent of his late mother that Jedediah felt a sharp pang of loss. "I have to go, Pa. You know I do." Jedediah looked at his son, really looked at him, seeing not just the boy he'd raised, but the man who stood before him now. Caleb had his mother's gentle heart and his father's steel backbone, a combination that made him loved by everyone who knew him, but also made it impossible for him to turn away when duty called. "I know," Jedediah said simply, though the words felt like swallowing ground glass. "When do you leave?" 3 days. Caleb's voice was steady, but Jedediah caught the slight tremor beneath the surface. "I'll take Blue, of course. The Army needs good horses, and there's none better." As if understanding the conversation, Blue stepped closer to Caleb, his dark eyes seeming almost human in their intelligence. The horse had never bonded with anyone the way he had with Caleb. It was as if they were 2 halves of the same soul. That evening, as father and son sat on the porch, watching the sun paint the mountains gold and crimson, they talked about everything except the war. They spoke of the cattle that would need moving come spring, of the fence that needed mending along the north pasture, of the neighbor's daughter who'd been casting eyes at Caleb since she turned 18. But beneath their words lay the unspoken, understanding that this might be their last evening together. "Pa," Caleb said as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, "if something happens to me out there, don't." Jedediah's voice was sharp. "Don't you dare talk like that." "But if it does," Caleb continued gently, "I want you to know that every good thing I am, every decent thought I've ever had, came from you. This ranch, this life you built, it made me who I am. And Blue. He reached out to stroke the horse's neck. Blue had taken to spending his evenings on the porch with them, as if he sensed the approaching separation. Blue will take care of me out there, and if the worst happens, he'll find his way back to you. Horses know things, Pa. They know. Things we can't even imagine. Jedediah wanted to argue, wanted to forbid his son from leaving, wanted to tie him up and keep him safe. But he'd raised Caleb to be honorable, and honor demanded that he let his boy become the man he was meant to be. You just make sure you come home, he said gruffly. Both of you. The morning of Caleb's departure dawned gray and cold, with a wind that cut through a man's coat like a knife. Jedediah had been up since before dawn, preparing supplies for the journey to Fort Benton. He packed extra grain for Blue, a small sewing kit for mending clothes, and his own father's razor, the one thing of value he owned that had belonged to his pa. Caleb emerged from the house, wearing his best clothes and carrying his grandfather's cavalry saber, the one Jedediah's father had carried in the Mexican War. The weight of 3 generations of McKenna men seemed to settle on the young man's shoulders as he strapped the blade to his side. Blue, saddled and ready, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. The horse stood perfectly still as Caleb checked and rechecked his gear, his usual playful spirit subdued by the solemnity of the morning. You remember what I taught you about reading the land, Jedediah said, helping his son secure his bedroll. Water runs downhill, north faces hold snow longer, and never trust a horse that won't look you in the eye. I remember, Pa. Caleb's voice was thick with emotion. I remember everything. They stood there for a moment, 2 men who had shared 24 years of life together, now facing the possibility that they might never see each other again. There were so many things Jedediah wanted to say, how proud he was, how much he loved his son, how terrified he was of losing the only family he had left. But the words stuck in his throat like burrs. Instead, he pulled out a small leather pouch from his vest pocket. This was your mother's, he said, pressing it into Caleb's hand. She always said it would keep her family safe. Caleb opened the pouch to reveal a small silver locket containing a pressed wildflower of forget-me, not that his mother had picked on their wedding day. His eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them back and tucked the locket carefully into his shirt pocket. I'll bring it back to you, he promised. You bring yourself back to me, Jedediah replied fiercely. The locket's just metal and flowers. You're what matters. Caleb mounted Blue, and for a moment the years fell away. Jedediah could see the 10-year-old boy who used to ride bareback through the meadows, whooping with joy. But the man who looked down at him now had his mother's compassion, tempered by hard-won wisdom. Take care of the ranch, Pa, and don't you dare try to work that north pasture by yourself. Hire Tommy Anderson, like we talked about. I'll hire help, Jedediah promised, though he had no intention of spending money on a hired hand when he could do the work himself. Blue danced sideways, eager to be moving, and Caleb had to steady him with a gentle hand. Easy, boy. We've got a long road ahead. As horse and rider moved down the dirt track that led away from the ranch, Jedediah walked alongside them for as far as his old legs would carry him. At the bend in the road where the pine trees would hide them from view, Caleb turned in his saddle for one last look at home. I love you, Pa, he called out. I love you too, son. Jedediah shouted back, his voice cracking with emotion. Then they were gone, swallowed by the forest and the morning mist. Jedediah stood there long after the sound of hoofbeats had faded, staring at the empty road and feeling as if half his heart had just ridden away. The months that followed were the longest of Jedediah's life. He threw himself into the work of a ranch with a desperate intensity, as if keeping busy could somehow bring his son home faster. He mended fences that didn't need mending, branded cattle that were already marked, and organized the barn so many times that he could find any tool in complete darkness. Letters came sporadically, precious pieces of paper that Jedediah read and reread until they were soft as cloth from handling. Caleb wrote of the journey to the war, of the other cavalrymen he'd met, of Blue's reputation as the finest horse in the regiment. He wrote of battles and skirmishes, of long marches and cold camps, but always with the confidence of a young man who believed he would live forever. "Blue saved my life yesterday," one letter read. "We were scouting ahead of the main force when Confederate cavalry surprised us. I gave Blue his head, and he took us through terrain that would have broken another horse's legs. The other boys are saying I should write a book about him when this is all over. Maybe I will. Tell me about home. Pa, tell me about the cattle and the weather and Mrs. Henderson's gossip. I dream about our porch every night and about the way the mountains look when the sun sets behind them. Blue gets restless. Sometimes, like he's homesick, too. Horses remember more than we give them credit for." But as winter melted into spring and spring bloomed into summer, the letters became less frequent and more guarded. Caleb wrote less about Blue's adventures and more about his fellow soldiers' boys who wouldn't be coming home. The war was taking its toll on the young man's spirit, and Jedediah could read between the lines of his son's careful words. "We lost Billy Patterson last week. You remember him, the red-headed boy from Butte who could make anybody laugh. He was talking about his girl back home when the sniper got him. It makes a man think about what's really important. If I don't make it back, Pa, know that I died trying to do right, and take care of Blue for me. He's earned his rest." That letter arrived in August, and it was the last one. September passed without word. October brought the first snows, and still no news. Jedediah haunted the post office in town, badgering the postmaster until the poor man started hiding when he saw the old rancher coming. He wrote letters to the War Department, to Caleb's commanding officers, to anyone who might have information about his son's fate. The responses, when they came at all, were form letters expressing regret that they had no information about Private Caleb McKenna. By November, Jedediah had accepted the truth in his heart, even as his mind refused to acknowledge. Its son was dead. The boy who had brought such joy and purpose to his life was lying in some unmarked grave hundreds of miles from home, and Jedediah would never even know where to lay flowers. The ranch felt hollow without Caleb's laughter echoing from the barn, without Blue's welcoming whinny when the horses caught sight of their favorite human. Jedediah found himself talking to the empty air, carrying on conversations with his son that would never be answered. The silence was suffocating. And then, on a gray December morning, when the first heavy snows of winter were beginning to fall, Jedediah heard something that made his heart stop. The sound of hoofbeats on the frozen road. Jedediah was repairing a loose board on the barn when he heard it, a familiar rhythm that sent him running toward the sound despite his aching joints. Through the swirling snow came a rider, and for one wild, impossible moment, Jedediah's heart soared with hope, but as the figure drew closer, his joy turned to ash. The horse was Blue. There was no mistaking that distinctive coat and proud bearing, but the saddle was empty. Caleb's beautiful blue roan approached the ranch alone, bearing scars of battle and months of hard travel. Blue's coat was matted and dull, his ribs showing through his winter fur. Scratches and old wounds crisscrossed his legs and flanks, and his eyes held a weariness that spoke of horrors witnessed and grief endured. But despite his exhaustion, he walked with purpose, his head high and his gaze fixed on Jedediah with an intelligence that was almost human. "Blue?" Jedediah's voice came out as a whisper, then louder. "Blue. Oh God, where is he? Where's my boy?" The horse stopped a few feet away, his breath creating clouds in the cold air. For a long moment, man and animal stared at each other, sharing a grief too deep for words. Then Blue stepped forward and gently pressed his great head against Jedediah's chest, and the old man broke down completely. He sobbed into Blue's mane, his body shaking with the force of his anguish. The horse stood perfectly still, as if understanding that this human needed this moment to fall apart. When Jedediah finally pulled back, his eyes red and swollen, Blue nuzzled his shoulder with heartbreaking gentleness. "He's gone, isn't he?" Jedediah asked, though he already knew the answer. "My boy's not coming home." Blue's response was to turn his head toward the south, his ears pricked forward as if listening to something Jedediah couldn't hear. Then he looked back at the old man with an expression that seemed to say, "But I know where he is." Over the following days, Jedediah nursed Blue back to health with the same care he might have given a wounded child. He fed the horse the best hay, rubbed healing salve into his cuts, and spent hours brushing his coat until it began to regain its luster. Blue accepted the attention with patient gratitude, but Jedediah noticed something strange about the horse's behavior. Blue had always been content to graze in the paddock or roam the nearby meadows, but now he spent his time at the fence facing south, staring toward the distant mountains with an intensity that was unsettling. When Jedediah approached him, Blue would turn and walk a few steps in that direction, and look back as if asking a question. "What is it, boy?" Jedediah asked one evening as he brought Blue his evening grain. "What are you trying to tell me?" Blue left his feed untouched and walked to the gate, pawing at the latch. When Jedediah opened it, the horse walked purposefully toward the barn, then stopped and looked back. It was clearly an invitation, or perhaps a demand. For 3 days, Blue repeated the same behavior. He would go to the gate, wait for Jedediah to open it, then walk toward the barn as if expecting to be saddled. On the 3rd day, something in the horse's eyes, a desperate urgency that Jedediah had never seen before, finally convinced him. "You want me to follow you, don't you?" Jedediah said, studying the horse's face. "You know where he is." Blue's response was to walk to where Caleb's saddle hung on its peg and stand beneath it, looking pointedly from the saddle to Jedediah and back again. The old man's hands shook as he lifted the saddle. It still smelled faintly of his son's cologne and the leather oil Caleb had preferred. As he settled it on Blue's back, he could almost feel Caleb's presence in the barn with them. "I don't know what you're asking of me, boy," Jedediah said as he tightened the cinch. "I'm not the rider I used to be, and winter's coming on hard. But if you know where my son is double quotes, his voice broke. If you can take me to him, then I reckon I can find the strength to make the journey." Jedediah packed carefully, knowing that this might be his last adventure. He filled his saddlebags with supplies for several weeks on the trail jerky, hardtack, coffee, and grain for Blue. He strapped his father's old rifle to the saddle and tucked his mother's Bible into his coat pocket. If he was going to find his son's grave, he wanted to say the proper words over it. As the sun rose on a bitter December morning, Jedediah mounted Blue for the first time since Caleb's departure. The horse felt different beneath him, more solemn, more purposeful. This wasn't the playful young stallion who used to steal sugar cubes from unwary pockets. This was a war horse who had seen death and carried that knowledge in his bones. "All right, Blue," Jedediah said, settling into the saddle. "Show me where he is." Blue needed no further encouragement. He struck out toward the south with a steady, ground-eating lope that spoke of long practice and grim determination. As the ranch disappeared behind them, Jedediah felt as if he were leaving his old life behind forever. Whatever they found at the end of this journey would change everything. The journey south was unlike anything Jedediah had ever experienced. Blue seemed to be following an invisible trail, turning at landmarks that meant nothing to the old man, but clearly held significance for the horse. They traveled through valleys Jedediah had never seen, along game trails that seemed to appear just when they needed them. On the second day, they stopped at a creek where Blue drank deeply before raising his head to stare at a lightning-struck pine on the far bank. Jedediah dismounted to fill his canteen and noticed something carved into the bark of a nearby aspen. C.M. Blue. His son had been here. He carved this on the way to war, didn't he? Jedediah asked softly. Blue's response was to touch the carving gently with his muzzle before turning to continue south. As they traveled, Jedediah began to understand that Blue wasn't just leading him somewhere. He was retracing a specific route. This was the path Caleb had taken, marked not by obvious signs, but by the subtle memory of a horse who never forgot anything important. They passed through a mountain pass where Blue stopped at a sheltered overhang. In the dirt, Jedediah found the remains of an old campfire and a rusty button from a cavalry uniform. Another night, they sheltered in a cave where someone had scratched a message on the wall. If you're reading this, tell my pa I tried to make him proud. C. McCunna, 1st Montana Cavalry. Each discovery was like a knife twist in Jedediah's heart, but also a blessing. He was following his son's footsteps, sharing the journey that had taken Caleb away from home. For the first time since Blue's return, Jedediah felt close to his son again. The weather grew worse as they traveled deeper into the mountains. Snow fell in thick curtains that reduced visibility to a few yards, and the wind howled through the peaks like the voices of the damned. But Blue pressed on with unwavering certainty, as if guided by an internal compass that pointed toward something more than mere magnetic north. On the 5th day, they descended into a valley Jedediah didn't recognize. The snow was lighter here, held back by the surrounding peaks, and the ground was scarred by what looked like the aftermath of battle. Broken wagon wheels lay scattered among the sagebrush, and the bleached bones of horses gleamed white in the winter sun. "This is where it happened, isn't it?" Jedediah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is where you lost him." Blue's ears flicked back as if the horse were listening to ghostly echoes of gunfire and dying men. Then he moved forward with renewed purpose, picking his way carefully through the debris of war toward a small hill that overlooked the battlefield. At the top of the hill, beneath a stand of mountain ash trees, Jedediah found what Blue had led him so far to see. A grave marker, crude but carefully made, bore his son's name carved deep into a piece of local granite. Caleb McKenna, age 24. He died brave. Jedediah slid from Blue's back and fell to his knees beside the grave, his body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Here was his boy, his only child, lying in cold ground hundreds of miles from home. The reality of it hit him like a physical blow, but as his grief began to subside into a more manageable ache, Jedediah noticed something odd about the gravesite. The marker was positioned strangely not at the head of the grave as was customary, but several feet to one side, and the ground around it showed signs of careful excavation and replacement, as if someone had dug here after the original burial. Blue, meanwhile, was exhibiting behavior Jedediah had never seen before. The horse was pawing at a specific spot near the base of the largest mountain ash, his hooves striking the frozen ground with methodical precision. When Jedediah approached, Blue stepped back and fixed him with that unervingly intelligent stare. "What is it, boy? What are you trying to show me?" Jedediah knelt and began brushing away the snow and dirt from the spot Blue had indicated. A few inches down, his fingers encountered something that made his heart skip, the edge of a wooden box, buried shallow enough to be found, but deep enough to be protected from the elements. With hands that trembled from more than just the cold, Jedediah excavated the box. It was about the size of a coffin meant for a child, made of sturdy pine and sealed with pitch to keep out moisture. When he lifted it from its hiding place, he was surprised by its weight. Whatever was inside was heavy. The box wasn't locked, but it was bound with rope that had been tied with Caleb's distinctive nada complex weave their neighbor had taught him years ago. As Jedediah worked to untie it, his mind raced with possibilities. What had his son hidden here? And why had Blue known exactly where to find it? The lid opened with a soft creak of aged wood, and Jedediah gasped at what he saw inside. The box was filled with gold coins, silver certificates, and bundles of paper money, more wealth than the old rancher had ever seen in one place. But it wasn't just the fortune that stunned him. It was the letter lying on top, written in his son's familiar hand and addressed simply, Pa. With shaking hands, Jedediah unfolded the letter. The paper was crisp and clean, protected by the sealed box from the elements that had scoured the battlefield. His son's words seemed to reach across the grave to speak to him one last time. Dear Pa, if you're reading this, then Blue has done what I taught him to do, and I'm probably dead. I'm sorry for that. Pa, I'm sorry for leaving you alone and for not being the son who comes home to take over the ranch. But I'm not sorry for fighting, and I hope you understand why I had to dot the money in this box isn't mine by rights, though it came to me honestly. 3 weeks ago, our unit captured a Confederate payroll wagon that was carrying funds to pay bounties for Union scalps money meant to buy the murder of our own soldiers. The other boys wanted to divide it up among themselves, but that didn't. Sit right with me. This money comes from blood, and I won't have blood money in my pockets, but I also couldn't let it go back to the Confederates to pay for more killing. So I decided to hold on to it until I could figure out what to do with it. I've been carrying it with me ever since, and I've had plenty of time to think about its proper use. I want this money to go towards something good. Pa, something that would make Ma proud and honor the memory of the boys who died to capture it. I've been thinking about that school. Ma always wanted to start for the children in our valley, the one she used to talk about when she thought I wasn't listening. She said every child deserved to learn to read and write, regardless of their family's circumstances. Use this money to build that school. Pa, build it children can see the mountains Ma loved, and make sure every child who wants to learn has that chance. Call it the Sarah McKenna School, after Ma, and know that every child who learns their letters, there is a victory over the darkness that's tried to consume this country. I taught Blue to bring you here if something happened to me. Horses have longer memories than people give them credit for, and Blue's smarter than most people I know. He'll remember the way, and he'll remember why it matters. Trust him, Pa. He's earned that trust. I hope you can forgive me for not coming home. I hope. You know that every day I've been gone, I've carried you and Ma and the ranch in my heart. You made me the man I am, and I tried to be worthy of that gift. Take Blue home and let him live out his days in the pasture by the creek, where he used to run as a young horse. He's earned his peace. And when your time comes to join Ma and me, know that we'll be waiting for you with all the love in our hearts. Your son, CALEBPS. Blue knows where I hid Ma's locket. Ask him to show you. Jedediah read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his cheeks and freezing in his beard. His son's voice seemed to speak from the paper, full of the honor and compassion that had defined his short life. Even facing death, Caleb had thought of others, first of the children who would benefit from education, of his father's need for closure, of Blue's faithful service. Following his son's final instruction, Jedediah looked at Blue. He says you know where her locket is, boy. Can you show me? Blue walked to the grave marker and began pawing at its base. Jedediah knelt and felt around the stone until his fingers found a small hollow that had been carved into the back. Tucked inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was his wife's silver locket, the one he had given Caleb on the morning of his departure. He opened it with trembling fingers and found the pressed forget-me-not still there, along with something new, a small piece of paper with a brief message in Caleb's handwriting. She would have been proud. Jedediah spent that night beside his son's grave, wrapped in his bedroll with Blue standing guard nearby. He talked to Caleb, as if his son could hear him, telling him about the ranch, about the neighbors who asked after him, about the sunset that had painted the mountains gold on the evening he'd left. It felt good to finally have a place where he could speak to his boy again. As dawn broke over the battlefield, Jedediah carefully replaced the wooden box in its hiding place, but not before removing his son's letter and the locket. The money would wait there until he could return with proper help to transport it safely. For now, it was enough to know where it was and what Caleb had intended for it. "Come on, Blue," he said, mounting the horse with stiff limbs. "Let's go home and build a school." The journey back was faster, but no less meaningful. Blue seemed lighter. Somehow, as if completing his mission had lifted a burden from his shoulders. He still moved with purpose, but now it was the purpose of a horse heading toward rest and green pastures, rather than one driven by duty to the dead. They stopped at the same landmarks on the way back, and Jedediah found himself seeing them differently, now that he understood their significance. Each carved initial, each abandoned campsite, each piece of military debris told part of the story of his son's final journey. It was a comfort to know that Caleb hadn't died among strangers. He had died in country that knew his name, following a trail that would always lead back home. As they crested the final hill and saw the ranch spread out below them, Jedediah felt something he hadn't experienced since Blue's return: hope. The buildings looked smaller than he remembered, and the pastures seemed emptier, but it was still home. And now he had work to do, important work that would honor both his son's memory and his wife's dreams. Blue whinnied as they approached the barn, a sound of contentment and homecoming that made Jedediah smile for the first time in months. The horse had completed his mission and brought his master's father safely home. Now he could rest. Spring came early to the McKenna ranch that year, and with it came the sound of hammers and saws as construction began on the Sarah McKenna School. Jedediah had returned to the battlefield with a small crew of trusted friends to retrieve Caleb's hidden fortune, and every penny of it went toward creating something beautiful and lasting. The school was built on the hill overlooking the ranch, where the children could see the mountain Sarah McKenna had loved, and where the afternoon light would pour through the windows to illuminate young faces bent over their books. It was a simple building but sturdy, designed to withstand the harsh Montana winters and provide a sanctuary of learning for generations to come. Blue spent his days in the pasture by the creek, grazing peacefully in the sunshine and watching the construction with mild interest. The horse had aged visibly since their return from the gravesite, his muzzle now gray and his step less sprightly, but his eyes remained bright and intelligent. Sometimes Jedediah would see him standing at the fence, looking south toward the mountains, and he wondered if Blue was remembering his fallen rider. The townspeople responded to the school project with enthusiasm that surprised Jedediah. Families who had never spoken to each other worked side by side to raise the walls and lay the roof. Children who would be the school's first students helped carry supplies and sweep sawdust, their excitement infectious. Mrs. Henderson, the doctor's wife, and the closest thing the valley had to a teacher, agreed to serve as the school's first instructor. Sarah always said education was the one gift that could never be taken away. She told Jedediah as they watched the children playing in the schoolyard. She would be so proud to see her dream coming true. On a warm day in late May, exactly 1 year after Caleb's death, the Sarah McKenna School opened its doors for the first time. 23 children ranging in age from 6 to 16 gathered. In the bright classroom, their faces shining with curiosity and possibility. Jedediah stood at the back of the room, his throat tight with emotion, as Mrs. Henderson called the first class to order. "Before we begin our lessons," she said, "I want to tell you about the woman this school is named after, and about her son who made it possible for us to be here today. She told them about Sarah McKenna's dream of universal education, about her belief that every child deserved the chance to reach their full potential. She told them about Caleb's sacrifice and his final gift to their community. And she told them about Blue, the faithful horse who had ensured that a son's love for his father and his community would not be forgotten. As the children listened with rapt attention, Jedediah slipped quietly from the room and walked to the window that looked out over the pasture. Blue was there, grazing in the morning sun, and for a moment Jedediah could swear he saw a young man in cavalry blue sitting astride the horse, both of them watching the school with pride and satisfaction. When he blinked, the vision was gone, but the feeling remained. His son was at peace, his wife's dream was fulfilled, and Blue had found his reward in the green grass and gentle sunshine of home. Jedediah McKenna lived to be 86 years old, long enough to see the first graduating class of the Sarah McKenna School go on to become teachers, doctors, lawyers, and leaders in their own right. He died peacefully in his sleep on a spring morning, found by the new schoolteacher who had come to invite him to the school's 10th anniversary celebration. Blue outlived his master by 3 years, spending his final days in the pasture where Caleb used to practice his riding. When the old horse finally lay down for the last time, the children from the school helped dig his grave beneath the mountain ash tree, where he used to seek shade on hot summer days. The school still stands today, enlarged and modernized, but retaining the essential character that Sarah McKenna would have recognized. A bronze plaque near the front door tells the story of its founding, and every student learns about the woman who dreamed of it, the son who died to make it possible, and the horse whose loyalty ensured that love would triumph over loss. In the Fats School's library, in a place of honor, sits a leather-bound journal containing Caleb's letters home and his final message to his father. Students often read these words and come away with a deeper understanding of sacrifice, honor, and the unbreakable bonds that tie families together across time and distance. And sometimes, on clear mornings when the mountain light falls just right, across the pastures, visitors to the school claim they can see them, a man and his horse, standing together in the meadow where they once played as boy and colt, watching over the children whose futures they helped secure. Whether it's truth or wishful thinking, no one can say for certain, but the children believe, as children always do, in the power of love to transcend death and the ability of faithful hearts to find their way home, no matter how far they may roam. The Sarah McKenna School remains a testament to the truth that some bonds are stronger than war, deeper than loss, and more enduring than time itself. In the end, that may be the greatest lesson of all.